Hey everybody, just here wanting to give you a quick update on what's going on. We are now, today of course, is January 6th. It is both the 2-year anniversary of the attack on the Capitol, and it is also the 4th day in which the United States has gone without a organized and established U.S. House of Representatives, as well as a speaker. So I wanted to give you guys an update, answer some of your questions that you might have, and figure out, try to communicate a little bit as to what's going on. We started today with, I believe our 11th round, maybe our 12th round, going into, or maybe it's even, what we had heard as of this morning was that Kevin McCarthy had made some inroads with the 21 holdouts for the speaker's vote within his caucus, and he had provided further concessions in order to secure some of these votes. So then we went to the 11th round, I believe, the 11th round of voting, and we are now in that first round this morning, and I apologize if I have my rounds mixed up, but in our first round this morning, he picked up double digits. So that big coalition of 21 people who were holding out on Kevin McCarthy has now shrunk to about 7. And so he picked up over a dozen people on over to his side, and that was a result of negotiations between Chip Roy of Austin and Fredericksburg and some other surrounding areas of Texas, as well as not just Kevin McCarthy himself, but Representative Patrick McHenry as well, who actually serves as the ranking member, or had served as the ranking member, stands to be the chairman, potentially, of the House Financial Services Committee. So the key question is, what did he negotiate away? Well, first of all, the whole reason I'm able to talk to you right now is because after 2 rounds of voting, the House and House Republicans were able to vote to adjourn. So the House is currently in adjournment between now and 10 p.m. At 10 p.m., myself and all the other members of Congress have to go back in there and get back to work. For reference, each one of these rounds can take anywhere between an hour and a half to 2 hours. Usually I feel like the average is about an hour 45 or so. And so if we're starting at 10, we're going to be there. It's going to be a late night. What did Kevin McCarthy negotiate away in order to pick up that, 13 or so votes? And the answer is a lot. The answer is almost everything. The answer is, it certainly seems as though Kevin McCarthy may have negotiated the speakership itself in order to placate some of these holdouts and win out these votes. I would say that a lot of these negotiations had to deal or fall within a couple of categories. One was rules changes. The other, I think, potentially some committee assignments and committee placements that were desired by some of these holdouts. And the third, I think, were some budgetary promises and considerations. A lot of these promises are completely untenable, and they really dramatically, deeply weaken Kevin McCarthy and his hand in the speakership. So let's start with one of the big things that he negotiated away. Kevin McCarthy agreed to a motion to vacate the chair. And this was something that the House Freedom Caucus has wanted for a while, which basically is that a motion to vacate the chair is that if people in the Republican caucus decide that they don't want Kevin McCarthy to be speaker anymore, they can raise a motion to vacate. And usually there are certain motions that require a high threshold. So for example, when you do what is known as a voice vote. If you ever watch the floor, you'll see the chair. They'll say, all those in favor say aye, and one side goes aye, and the other says all those opposed nay, nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. You have the ability to ask for a recorded vote. Even just to get a recorded vote to override the yeas and nays, you need like dozens of people to just stand up and support that motion. That's just to get a recorded vote. Kevin McCarthy agreed that the threshold to raise a motion to vacate the chair is one person. One. So that means that if at any point in the next 2 years, one Republican stands up and says, I want Kevin McCarthy to go, the whole House grinds to a halt, and we have to take a floor vote on whether Kevin McCarthy remains the speaker or vacates the chair. Now, it seems as though in the current rule structure, Democrats would not be able to stand up and attempt to vacate the chair. However, if a Republican does do that, Democrats will support vacating the chair, which means Kevin McCarthy, with the current margins, can only stand to lose, depending on the margin, about 4 to 5 people, 4 to 5 votes. So really, if just 4 to 5 Republicans want to vacate the chair with Democratic support, with all the Democrats voting yes in support of that motion, he's gone. And how that positions Kevin McCarthy is in 2 ways. One is that he's going to be held hostage very often and very frequently. If any time Kevin McCarthy does something that the furthest right flank of his party doesn't like, any one of them can say, I'm gonna raise a motion to kick you out. And everything stops and the whole House is going to vote. And Kevin McCarthy's speakership could be up for a vote as often as they want. And so he's going to be highly incentivized to try to make every single person happy, not just the right wing not just the furthest right wing of his party, but literally every single person in his party. I don't even want to call them moderates, people who are more institutionalist or more longstanding members. Any single one of them can raise a motion to vacate at any time. And if you are a leader in any party, or if you're just a human in this world, you pretty quickly understand that you will never be able to make everybody happy. And so from day one, what Kevin McCarthy has conceded is a very untenable, weakened position that he has. He is hobbling himself for the next 2 years. It also seems to be that there are certain other rules, concessions that he is agreeing to that we're trying to navigate in what has actually been hard committed in the House rules versus not. But Kevin McCarthy is in trouble. He's coming in as a dramatically weakened leader. And this is not just about him personally. It's not just about him as a speaker, but the entire Republican Party has now dramatically weakened itself because there are very few mechanisms and there's a lot of loopholes for everybody to be taking each other hostage. And that's one of the things that people, that's like important to understand, is that people may say, oh, the Freedom Caucus has gained so much in this. They've gained a lot of power, this, that, and the other. And, to some extent, it's not to refute that entirely, but they too have also signed themselves up to be taken hostage by others in their party too. And when you have a margin so slim, anybody can walk. You can have anybody to walk. That could be from any flank or wing, whether it's ideological, geographic, identity-based, etc. Anybody can walk. And in fact, there's a huge amount of incentive to be the small cohort that grinds your party to a halt. And so that's what Kevin McCarthy is currently agreeing to. For people who tend to criticize military spending or things like that, it actually seems like these negotiations are actually protecting to a certain extent certain military funding, but they are trying to freeze certain points. That is an area of agreement, actually an overlap between progressives and certain elements of the Republican Party who believe in freezing military spending, but I think that that's more of just a verbal handshake from Kevin McCarthy. If I were one of these folks, I wouldn't really trust him on that one. The main mechanism that he's using to balance the budget, that he's agreeing to in order to balance the budget, is not military. He has agreed to fight as hard as he can to balance the budget by eviscerating Medicare, Social Security, and other discretionary programs like anything else that has to do with healthcare, education, child care, etc. In the next 2 years. You're going to see the House trying to take away Social Security. So if you are a senior, if you're a child under the age of 18 that has lost a parent, in case you don't know that, if you are a person that's in a situation where your parent has passed away, like that happened in my family, or God forbid that happens, but you should know that if you are under the age of 18 and you lose a parent, Social Security actually helps take care of you too. It's not just for seniors. And so Kevin McCarthy is going to be, gutting Medicare. He has pre-agreed to that, which is a very difficult position to put his own caucus in. Because if you are a party that's trying to remain in the majority, you don't really want a lot of your members, especially ones who are in vulnerable districts, being forced to vote publicly to gut Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, etc. Because these are issues that seniors care very much about. Seniors vote in very high numbers, and seniors also vote within Republican primaries and elections as well. So that is kind of entering this really difficult position for the Republican Party. I personally think that it positions the Republican Party right out of the gate for an uphill 2024. But regardless, these are some of the concessions that Kevin McCarthy is making. There's also committees and committee structure and committee assignments. There are several members in his caucus that are trying to demand certain chairmanships, like chairs of committees or subcommittees. And that is also one of the things that is kind of one of those negotiating pieces and negotiating chips. And one of the reasons that also creates some rancor within the party is that if you're a member of Congress and you're told that committee chairs are determined largely by your tenure, and whether you agree with it or not, put that aside, the way that the rule currently is through a seniority system, right? And so if you really want to chair the Armed Services Subcommittee, or if you really want to chair an Appropriations Subcommittee, those people have been waiting in line in your party as Republicans, have been sitting there for 10, 15, 20 years, waiting for that chair. And now, all of a sudden, you have someone else that's trying to hold their vote hostage in exchange for that chair, leapfrogging over members of their own party that have tried to follow the rules and work hard to get to that chairmanship. You are really upsetting a lot of people internally, and you're setting up a fight. And so that's another area as well. Some of the other concessions is that Kevin McCarthy, I think, is agreeing to something I believe known as the Holman Rule, where House Republicans in passing the budget, can try to defund any specific federal employee that they want. And so take away the salaries of, for example, any officials. Like let's take, for example, Dr. Fauci, since he's no longer serving, since he has retired. They could try to put into the budget a ban on federal compensation for Dr. Fauci or Dr. Fauci's position. And that way, that's how they can try to force people out of the Justice Department, prevent people from investigating domestic terrorism, prevent the Justice Department or other departments from investigating neo-Nazi groups, etc. And so this is some of what we are looking at in terms of what Kevin McCarthy is giving up for his speakership. Now, what is interesting here is that negotiations for the speakership are not uncommon. They happen every single cycle. They just have never spilled out into not just public view, but I also want to be very clear about the costs involved in going about these negotiations publicly instead of internally. When you go ahead publicly, the costs of not having a House for several days means that there is no Congress. And if there is no Congress, that means nobody here watching has had a U.S. federal representative for a week. And if you have an emergency, if all of a sudden you have a family member abroad that is passing away and you need to reunite your family internationally and you needed an expedited passport, or you have an international emergency, these are the types of things that your members of Congress can intercede in. If you have a massive IRS issue and that involves thousands of dollars, your member of Congress can't help you. We have not been able to help any constituents in the last several days. And as each day goes on, the propensity for an emergency increases. And when that propensity for an emergency increases, I want to be very clear, it is absolutely a dire national security issue. It has impacts on the order of succession in the United States. If you don't have a Speaker of the House, you have no third in line to the succession. And as that window drags on and goes longer, it becomes a very real issue. And so there's the actual just base implications on how it affects everybody, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or an independent. Just as a citizen or resident of the United States of America, you have been affected in the last couple of days. So there's that issue. But also, politically, there are issues to this as well. First of all, Kevin McCarthy comes in very wounded, and it looks like he may be able to pull off the votes necessary tonight, but this is your first test as Speaker. This is your first test as a party. And what was proven is that in the year or several months that these negotiations were possible, because I want to be very clear, these negotiations don't start on the floor. They start a year in advance. And this Freedom Caucus has had some of these demands since before the November election. So this is really putting on display the weakness and dysfunction of the Republican Party and Kevin McCarthy. And when you look weak, and when you actually display all of these fractions in public, you actually reveal a great deal of information. So now for us, for example, as House Democrats, I know a lot more about the Republican caucus at the end of this week than I did at the beginning of this week. One thing that I will hand to the House Freedom Caucus is that the overall broad point of the concentration of power in leadership being way too focused is a legitimate one. Now, how they go about trying to solve that is, I think, where there may be differences. But one thing that we see is that they have transmitted to their opposition a great deal of their fault lines and where those fault lines are. And that is highly valuable information. Think of it as any negotiation. You know, I think of politics, a lot of people use sports analogies in politics, and I actually think politics is a lot more like poker. And we now know, you know, in poker, what you are trying to throw off is full information as to what's in your hand. And a lot of information was just transmitted to the world. And it's not that that information is good or bad or positive or negative. All information is valuable. And so we just had a full week of lots of conversations. And those conversations are internal. Even if you don't have a single conversation with a member of the other party, just sitting there on the floor and watching who's talking to who's sitting alone, who is circling back, who is behaving what, in what ways, gives you valuable information. I've learned a lot about Kevin McCarthy this week. I've learned a lot about his leadership style. I've learned a lot about who his allies are. I've learned a lot about where his dissenters are. I have learned a lot about the character of that dissent. And what that helps us is in trying to identify not just weaknesses to exploit, but actually trying to identify who in that caucus operates more politically and who in that caucus operates out of principle and who in that caucus operates out of grievance. And it can be helpful. And I think that, you know, that is immensely helpful to anybody who is looking to get something done. Because I really believe that regardless, you know, people try to convey politics as just this two-dimensional left-right spectrum, and it's really not. It's really, really not. I would wager that almost every single member of the Democratic caucus, perhaps the Republican caucus, but I don't know, but maybe, but every single member of the Democratic caucus has some bipartisan principle. And people try to talk about far left, far right, but there's so many more dimensions to that than there are. There are members of both caucuses who are anti-establishment. I am one of them. And so you learn about some of the alliances that you could potentially make in order to democratize the House. There are members who are bipartisan on issues of defense. There are members who are bipartisan. I sit on oversight. There are some Republicans that I agree with in terms when it comes to issues of surveillance and violation of civil liberties with respect to surveillance, warrantless searches, etc. You know, I think it's one of those things that they seem to be giving up a lot. One of the concerns, though, is that in stepping back from looking at this from a red team or blue team type of perspective, is that some of these concessions could stand to create a very dysfunctional and even slower dynamic, which is not good for anybody in the country in general. And that is a dynamic that we're going to have to manage. It looks like right now that Republicans may have already locked in certain political and structural dynamics that could send us into government shutdown. Not immediately, but these are now things that are far more possible on the horizon that were not possible just a few days ago in the 117th Congress. So we are looking at already conflicts around the debt ceiling, which could have catastrophic impacts or very, very large risks for the U.S. economy. we are looking at showdowns around government funding and shutting down the government. And we all know, that government shutdowns, who they hurt most are everyday working people who rely on a paycheck, not a lot of multimillionaires in Congress that are making these decisions, but it's your people who work for the TSA. It's people who work as everyday rank and file government officials who are just trying to do their job, clock in and clock out. And Republicans have now set up basically a scenario to put a government shutdown on the table. And so this is something that I think these are all dynamics that are at risk, and you kind of can't help but wonder why Kevin McCarthy didn't make these concessions, since he ultimately made these concessions, why he didn't make them before going into 12, 13 rounds, humiliating rounds, where he has given up public leverage, his public standing, he's given up rules, he's given up authority. If he made these concessions just a few days ago, we likely wouldn't be in this scenario. I see some people say, Dems should negotiate to get concessions. We do all the time. But what we don't do is bring them publicly in order to empower not just Republicans, but the fascist flank of the Republican Party. And ironically, a lot of the concessions that Kevin McCarthy, in nature, they're not the same ones, of course, but the nature of some of these concessions actually do overlap with some of the concessions that have been the subject of private negotiations on the Democratic side. We have also negotiated for certain budgetary, we have negotiated for certain budgetary rules. We've negotiated there have been negotiations around committees, budgetary rules, and very similar kind of scopes and areas. But we do that prior to getting to the floor vote. Not only that, but when people say Dems should do this, there's also a very critical question of just basic math. The House Freedom Caucus comprises of we see the holdouts here comprised of 21 members. That is a huge faction of your party to go into a vote day without negotiating without satisfying. And for Republicans for Kevin McCarthy to go into a speakership vote while knowing that he does not have 21 people is almost unthinkable. So there's just the basic math of the issue. Democrats do not have a flank of 21 that would do that. Now, we do have groups of 10, 20, 30 that do negotiate for things, but we do it before the actual floor vote. So there's just the basic question of numbers. 21 that would do that. And secondly, that also speaks to the Republican base. The Republican base is very different than the Democratic base, in nature, in issue, in parallel, etc. The Democratic Party is a very diverse party, whether people like that or not just in terms of identity. We are very diverse in terms of identity, but we're also diverse in terms of ideology, we're diverse in terms of age, all of those things. And that diversity means that our Democratic base is very diverse in its interests as well. And the Democratic base would not sustain this kind of action. Because it weakens the priorities of all the other members of that coalition. And that, I think, is a core element. The Republican base is a base of an ideological extreme that is funded by billionaires. And not only that, but the Republican base also has a massive, utterly massive propaganda outlet in Fox News. There really were comments made on the floor that that the House was going to adjourn and people were going to see, members of Congress were going to see what people like Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity said on television, mostly Tucker Carlson. The Democratic Party, for as much as people are saying, oh, CNN is left-wing, it's not. It's run by conservatives. Or MSNBC, all of those things. That MSNBC is no Fox News. MSNBC is not a propaganda outlet. The idea of MSNBC being some kind of like socialist outlet is, we all know that's a joke. It's an utter joke. Meanwhile, fascism does have a primetime slot on television that issues propaganda each and every single day. And so the Republican base is much more flatly ideological. The Republican Party is not diverse. The Republican Party is not diverse in identity. And as a consequence, their main spectrum is ideological. And what does really kind of delineate their base is it's a race for who is most acquiescent to Donald Trump or the Trumpian wing of the party or the neo-Nazi wing of the party, the fascist wings of the party. The closer you are to Proud Boys is what delineates much of the Republican base. And that's just simply not the case with the Democratic Party. Some people may be upset about that. Some people, may think it should be one way or another, but I'm trying to explain what this coalition actually is. And so as a consequence, if you are a Matt Gaetz or a Lauren Boebert's a different case because she barely won her race. If you are a member of kind of like this far right wing of the party, like a Paul Gosar or one of these folks, your base rewards you for this kind of behavior. But in the Democratic coalition, Democratic base is much more complex than that. We have very strong progressives in our base. Of course, we are just starting to elect members of Congress who do not identify as late stage capitalists. The number is pretty low. We're still in the very low single digits when it comes to that. And if you notice the pattern of what has happened here, the moment Kevin McCarthy's holdout votes went below 10, the whole thing collapsed. We are now in adjournment. They are in active negotiations, and it does look like they may be able to secure this either tonight or very soon. And it really goes to show how much you need of a coalition in order to really forcefully negotiate for these things. So when people say, why don't we do this? First of all, there's a lot of cost and dysfunction. Second of all, those people who are holding out right now, they may have made certain structural gains, but they have also made incredible reputational and relational harm within their caucus. And so if you are trying to get something done within your caucus moving forward, you still need members of your caucus. And that at the core is an element of electoral politics that is simply inescapable. Even when you look at someone like Bernie Sanders' tenure in the House, where he was the amendment king, you needed your party to pass your amendments. And so, you have this faction that is in a lot of trouble moving forward, including despite having made certain structural gains. So a lot of people, this was like very bloody. Like think of it like a really bloody bar fight, and we haven't even been sworn in yet. As opposed to the Democratic caucus. Now, the strength here when you are in a minority the play here is to be united as much as possible, because if you don't have people who break, then you can pick off the other side with just a matter of a handful of people. So as long as Democrats don't remain united in a minority, then all the votes you need to win on a certain thing are, depending on how a margin is, 3, 4, or 5. And people say Lauren Boebert has more spine than you. Lauren Boebert won her race by 500 votes. Lauren Boebert took a Trump plus 9 district and nearly lost it to an up-and-coming Democrat as an incumbent member of Congress. Lauren Boebert is dramatically weakened. And the people of Colorado nearly sent her packing. If 500 people voted differently that day, this would not be happening right now. And so, if you're a Republican, if you're a hard-standing Republican, she almost cost you your majority. And if it, frankly, wasn't for the New York State Democratic Party and the New York State Democratic Party's leadership and the incompetence there, we would be having that gavel right now. If between them and Lauren Boebert, we would be having a Democratic majority at this moment. So, this idea they are somehow winning, let's just also take a step back and observe that none of these debates resulted in any policy substance. None. This is not a caucus that is organized. The Freedom Caucus is not organized around any core policy issue. Progressives, we organize around Medicare for All. We organize around a Green New Deal. Like those concessions that, even if it's not all the whole farm all at once, but the building blocks to get us there, that's what we fight for and fight towards. But these folks, they're negotiating around committee assignments for themselves, certain rules changes. Not all of them are bad, mind you, but not all of them are good either. And they're really organized around grievance. And so, I think sometimes people conflate the necessary work of outside organizing with the internal work of legislating. And the fact of the matter is, you cannot do one without the other. I mean, I do think there's a decent amount of organizing you can do outside of legislative goals. There's plenty. You can organize a tenants union. You can unionize your workplace. You can do all sorts of stuff. But the idea that you can push and emphasize legislative goals without an outside, that part I think is untenable. At least as a progressive, actually just in general, because the right wing of the Democratic Party also organizes on the outside for their internal goals, but they do it with money. And as progressives, we have to do it with people. And so, when you have a base that focuses most of its ire towards the people on their side because YouTube algorithms reward that, you're just playing into the hands of the capitalists who run those algorithms. And so I'm not saying that all these folks in these media outlets who stir these things up are bad. Far from it. There are incredible people doing very thoughtful work. But there are also a lot of people who make and determine what they're going to make their videos on based on YouTube views and based on algorithms. And those algorithms almost always reward left infighting. That's what's going to get you your clicks, right? And so you have to be really thoughtful about some of that and how you navigate in that, because at the end of the day, we still have very small numbers in Congress, and our central goal, at least ours, is in growing those numbers, which is why we're really excited this Congress to add to our existing squad. Like in 2014, we came in, it was just 4 of us. Then in 2018, we added folks like Jamal Bowman, we added, progressives, other progressive, we had Cori Bush, of course, and now this Congress, we have now added Greg Casar, Maxwell Frost, Delia Ramirez, like many other progressives into Congress. And now, where we started with 4, we're getting a little closer to that double-digit representation. And that's when things start to get really interesting should we win back the House in 24. You know, this is a team sport, and I think a lot of times people think elections are just about set it and forget it. I'm just going to pull my lever for someone and let them do the work. And if you're that kind of person, you know, I'm not sitting here to knock that. But if you are a left or if you are a progressive organizer, what we need the most support in is support during game time, during legislating. And I can't tell you how common it is for us to look to guidance, look to the grassroots for guidance. And sometimes you don't hear anything until after something bad happens. And so a lot of what we're doing right now is building our infrastructure, not just internally, but also starting to invest and work with our outside partners in building up more of that infrastructure, that organizing infrastructure externally. And the fact of the matter is that the left in the United States has been persecuted at different points in history for a very long period of time. And as a result was really winnowed very much. And for people who may ask how or what or why, there are so many ways you can look at it. They have been surveilled, jailed, you know, etc. for a very long period of time. And so, you know, I just think that we are at a point of increasing and ascending organizing awareness in the United States. But we have more to go. And the more we talk with each other, the more we organize, the more that we can do. So anyways, it is 6 p.m. And we're going to be reconvening the House in about 4 hours. I've got some work to do. And it does look like the Republican caucus may come to a consensus tonight around 10 p.m. So for people who have been really closely watching this, you can turn on C-SPAN or MSNBC or CNN or Fox, or you can turn on C-SPAN at 10 p.m. That's when the House is going to reconvene. It seems like Kevin McCarthy might get the votes tonight. And if he does, then the speaker will be selected. The House will be sworn in finally. And we'll see what happens, because the first vote of the House after the speaker's vote is the rules package. And so we'll see if they try to raise the rules package tonight after being sworn in, or if they'll try to raise it first thing on Monday. But the first vote that has to happen after your speaker vote is the rules package, and that's when we're really going to see the final touches on what exactly Kevin McCarthy gave away. So have a good night.